Okay. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are moving into the final session for today, and I have to tell you that it was utterly impressive for me when I did a milk round of all these 5 sessions to see how wonderful the level of discussion was. So what we're now going to do is to call upon the gifted rapporteurs who have been taking notes diligently, and they are going to give us a distilled version of what it is that transpired in your breakout groups. So let me start with the moderator on cooking. If you're not ready, we can give to somebody else. Are you ready? Yeah.
So the cooking session involved a moderator, Lupita Montoya, who is from the engineering department here at the University of Colorado, as well as Christian Larange, who, as our expert, who works with the Engines Lab research team in product development, works closely with EnviroFit, and tests and ensures that these stoves are fit for human health, and that's sort of his number one concern and the thing that he reiterated throughout the session, that not just are these stoves efficient, but he really works from the health side.
I have the first three.
And sort of just to start with some statistics about cook stoves and cooking in developing countries. 7% of global energy comes from household biomass in developing countries mainly. And 90% of that energy comes from wood. So there's a lot of burning of biomass and wood specifically. And I was talking about the number of premature deaths that occur annually because of exposure to this indoor air pollution that comes from burning this biomass. And he said he likes to break it down into the day. 4,000 people a day, and just 40 people during just the presentation die prematurely because of exposure to indoor air pollution. There's also an estimate that about 50% of the human-generated black carbon, which is contributing to global warming, is generated from these cook stoves, from these these indoor stoves. So we started out by talking about how this is kind of a hard problem to solve. The number one reason is that cooking habits are often the last things that people want to change. There's a lot of tradition that goes into people's cooking. Every region is unique, so you can't just come up with one answer for the entire world. And there's sort of a tradition of failure in this area because so many people with good intentions have gone in and tried to create solutions and have, in some cases, created more problems. They've supplied stoves that don't work, or they've supplied stoves that are not the appropriate technology for the region which they're trying to reach out to. Additionally, there's the problem of a growing gap, a growing population. A lot of the largest amount of growth are in these countries that are burning this biomass. So sort of as the need is increasing, there's an increasing number of people, so the demand is increasing, and you just have to keep coming up with this technology. The other problem, like I said, is different fuels. Even in similar regions, different communities cook with different fuels, whatever is nearby. And so these stoves have to reflect the types of fuels that are being used. And they need to both look good and work. In some cases, there's been some great stoves that have been made, and they don't look great, and people think, well, I don't want to invest in that project. I mean, in that type of technology, because it's not something that's appealing. Also talked a little bit about gender issues surrounding the problem. Sometimes women who are actually cooking in the house really want these stoves, but men who aren't so much exposed to this cooking talk about, well, this is my money and I don't want the stove. So that's something that needs to be worked on as well. And with regard to the different fuels, sort of a quick anecdote. So half the population cooks on biomass and 70% cook on wood-like products. But even among these wood-like products, Christian Larange talked about how a stove that had been used in the field for 2 years and worked great, they suddenly used it in a certain community, and because that community was cooking with coconut husks, within 3 weeks the stove broke down because it was creating a chemical at such a high temperature that just caused the stove to corrode and no longer function. So then sort of jumping into solutions to the problems that these cook stoves pose, talked about how education is very important. And hopefully with the Global Alliance project that Hillary Clinton's been working on, she's suggested anywhere from $50 to $100 million. $50 million to $100 million will be spent on cooking projects within the next 5 years. And Kristen Laurent has a lot of thinks and has a lot of hope that a lot of this will go towards education. Also talked about that it's really important for people to be working together and coming up with a formulated plan. And that sometimes when you give away large numbers of these cook stoves to populations, people just aren't quite as invested because they're not taking the time to incorporate that technology into their lives and feel like it's a part of their lifestyle. So in talking about working together and education, there's sort of a need for a multi-step solution. Like I said, there's not one solution that's going to cover everything because there's so many different factors that play into it. So thinking about what alternatives are available, thinking about what kind of grassroots approaches can be taken, finding improvements for certain fuel productions. One in particular is charcoal. It still needs a lot of work in how you're going to develop products that burn charcoal. And then just kind of talking about targeting markets. Can you look at these communities ahead of time and come up with solutions that are going to fit specific markets? And you talked about how that's a lot of the work they're doing right now in the lab in Fort Collins is, targeting each specific area and being able to move into new areas that they haven't worked with yet. And finally, just the discussion of developing a framework. Talking about how if you're going to be working with a population, there needs to be something that, even if they're going to be developing the stoves in sort of an artisan manner, you can't just go in and teach someone how to develop a stove and then leave. There has to be an understanding of why you're building the stove and the way you're building it, and how that's beneficial to human health. And so training people about how to develop stoves, and that developing process is often the challenging thing. Someone could maybe make this technology after a couple days. They may not understand it completely, but the technology's there. It's working with educators and cultural practices and engineers in order to develop a framework that then is sustainable. Thank you.
Thank you very much,
So I participated in the breakout section with illumination with Mark Bent from Sunlight Solar and Doug Vilsack from Elephant Energy, two people with amazing experience both in the field and theoretically have a substantial knowledge grasp on the field technologically, and it was a pleasure to be hosted by you both. So we broke down our conversation in terms of framing the issue, because I think one problem we have in disseminating and getting publicity for some of these problems in the developing world is how the issue is framed. If it's framed in terms of an educational problem or a social justice problem or a public health problem. So we discussed how access to illumination could be broken down and categorized into each of those different themes. And to do that, we all kind of shared a little bit about ourselves and an anecdote about our experience with illumination. And the thing that was really clear in that session was that illumination is a cross-cutting issue. It affects everything that we do. It affects young girls who need to study for school. It affects public health because women breathe kerosene gas, which, not gas, but, and I think it's hard to define the problem. I think it's hard. And I think the best comment that came out of that session that I think kind of quantifies what we're dealing with is that a candlelit dinner is very romantic, but a candlelit surgery certainly is not. And The second thing we talked about was barriers to kind of getting these great technologies into the communities that need them the most. And in terms of barriers, the one that stood out the most was distribution and how we can kind of work within traditional entrepreneurial frameworks to get technologies from the companies to on-the-ground communities. And it's challenging because a lot of the supply chains are segregated. So you have your lights made in China, but assembly is on the ground, and there's a lot of middlemen involved, which everybody needs to take a profit from that. So that was definitely a major barrier in terms of getting the most benefit to the communities. And corruption. There's a story that 1,500 or 15,000 BOGO lights were stuck in the customs in Ghana for 2 years already, and there's kind of logistical issues when you go into places that don't necessarily have the same bureaucratic framework as we do here, which poses challenges. Costs, that was definitely another barrier that although the communities, people without access to illumination spend nearly 20 to 30% of their disposable income on candles or kerosene, that a lot of times they don't have the capital to spend $15 on a BOGO light right then. Other things were definitely cultural barriers, just in terms of what's appropriate in any given community in terms of color or use, the size of the beam of light, for example. And then we broke down, after kind of discussing the major barriers, we talked about solutions and how we can try to start to combat some of these issues. We briefly discussed local distribution chains and trying to get production and construction dissemination into one country alone so that you cut down transportation costs and middlemen. We talked briefly about community cost sharing and how maybe that's a way to cut down on the inaccessibility to lump sums of cash. Microcredit was posed as a solution. Some people talked about legislation as the only way that we can start to get things moving in terms of tax breaks and issues like that. Flexible business models, because technology is changing all the time. It's important for businesses to be able to adapt and change to new needs. So I think, this was a good story too, about leasing lights. I love that story, is that in one village in Africa, a local entrepreneur would ride around on a bike at night and rent the BOGO lights for the night and collect it in the morning. And it was rented at a price that was less than kerosene, so it was beneficial for the people renting the lights, and it also was income generating within the community. And lease-to-own programs were also discussed. I think the best thing to take away from the illumination session is that it's a big problem, it's an important problem, and technology is not the issue. Technology is not the barrier. We have the appropriate technology, and it's just a matter of collaborating and getting it to people who need it most.
Communication.
So we had the pleasure of hearing from Kim Shex, the director of the Charcoal Project. Thanks for coming. And also of our moderator, Paul Ohm, who is an associate professor of law here at the CU Law School. And just to start us off on an interesting point, addressing one of the important technologies I think helps us with communication and communicating solutions for energy poverty to other parts of the world was this idea that we can actually use mediums like YouTube to send blueprints of the energy technologies that we're talking about to other sides of the world. Now I thought that was fascinating. The main point of our discussion, though, wasn't the technologies of communication. It was actually the importance of marketing our goals and marketing our issues to those who might be able to actualize change the best. Now, when looking at these issues, I'm gonna go over first the audiences that we're trying to address, and then the techniques that we're gonna use. And we're gonna want to focus on the message that we're sending, the goals we're trying to implement, and then finally the roadblocks that stand in our way. So in addressing our audience, there's two important demographics to consider. First, the industrialized world, and second, the developing world. Now, in the industrialized world, we're going to want to get our message out to the policymakers, the technology innovators, the people who donate the money, academics and NGOs, the media, and the public. Now, in the developing countries, we're going to want to target the people who have the ability to invest and to create and also to educate. We want to address the regional governments and also ground level practitioners. Now, in defining our message to these audiences, Kim brought up the important point that in our general sphere, there are three main issue points, and that is the sexy beast issues that our audiences will listen to. And those are issues like HIV and malaria right now. Now, the next issues of sort are the giant snails, clean water, air pollution. These are hard to define, these are hard to solve because they're so big, but our energy poverty issue is addressed in the last section, which is the lost kittens, and that is those that are the hardest to get people to listen about and the hardest to define. What exactly is energy poverty? Outside this circle, I'm not sure many could define that, and I think that's an important point. Now, when we're relating back to how to address these people, we want to look at what definitions are going to work on them and what mediums are they going to look at. So in doing this, obviously we're going to have to focus on a wide range of mediums, a wide range of definitions, because we want to really capture the attention of all the audiences that I mentioned. So what exactly is energy poverty? Well, it's probably harder to find this issue rather than tell you what other issues energy poverty affects. Now, just in our short discussion, we addressed poverty, gender, education, healthy ecosystems, climate change, gender, women's education, women's rights. So how can we communicate that these issues stem directly from our energy poverty issues? So really then, we're going to want to bring our energy poverty issue out from the cold. So in doing this, how can people relate to this? I think strong visuals was definitely appropriate. The internet and YouTube, television, Hulu commercials, but striking visuals that touch human emotions is the main key. Because there is this need to connect with people to get the message across. And overall, these tactics put together hopefully will create a movement that energy poverty is people's #1 priority. And not because maybe specifically of energy poverty, but because it specifically addresses the issues that they are already in touch with. So in investing in specific solutions, you get a better return for investment. So what are these specific solutions? Well, a few stories that we talked about were how we can really relate back to human emotion. So water sources are running out for nomadic tribes in all different parts of the world, and this has caused them to wage war on each other. That's a pretty prominent story, and if we can relate that back to energy poverty, then the issue becomes more memorable. Now, charcoal cartels send out women and children to chop down forests, and in doing so, they not only contribute to the deforestation issues, but they also are killing off gorilla populations. Now, that's also a memorable story, and I think that touches on the human emotion side. So if we can get our audiences to accept that this is an issue, then assimilate these issues into their plans, and then eventually implement the energy poverty solutions that we can come up with, then I think we have done our job. And so just in reiterating, define the message, reach the audience, relate back to many issues that energy poverty addresses, and finally relate the issues back to the people and the people that they concern the most. Thanks.
Okay. So there's a strong sentiment that the next world war will be fought over water. But when we think about the major water challenges we're facing, we're really dealing with two different issues. First is the governmental level, the larger issues of, governments deciding between each other how to allocate water, dealing with their, their water issues within their own nations, how to provide utility services, etc., to their people. And then the other issue is the everyday issue of people just needing drinking water. And while we don't really have a lot of control over what governments do, we can take steps to help people with their everyday drinking water issues. So that's what our group focused on. So how do we get technologies to people? One thing to keep in mind that our group discussed is that we're really dealing with a matter of degrees here. If your water is, coming straight out of a ditch with lots of contaminants, it's better for you to use a cloth to filter at least some of that out than to do nothing at all. So already you stepped up a degree if you're just using that level of filtration. So when we talk about technology to help people with drinking water, we're really talking about a number of different steps. So helping people get that kind of technology really hinges first and foremost upon increasing awareness of what people can do to improve their own water situation right now. And one key in that is helping people understand how to keep their water sources clean in the first place. One thing our group talked about was that people can collect rainwater, but unless they have the ability to prevent that rainwater from then getting contaminated, or they have the materials to make sure that the rainwater's collected in a clean way, it's still not going to be clean. So helping people manage that. And then the other issue we talked about there was helping people understand how to do things like keep livestock out of their water sources, fencing off areas, or using other measures to ensure that their water sources are not being contaminated by animals, and in addition, making sure people understand how to keep human waste out of their water sources are keys there. And one resource everybody can go look at for stuff on that is the EPA Source Water Protection Program, which actually has a number of different categories you can look at, helping people understand how to keep their water clean. Other methods we talked about people using to ensure they have clean water. Boiling. Boiling is pretty effective, but it's not effective unless people are doing it correctly. So if you only boil your water for 5 minutes, it's not going to kill everything you need it to kill in order for it to be safe to drink. So making sure people understand that. A lot of people in the world we discussed are using chlorine treatments, and those are great. That's a great, small step that can be useful. And then, of course, filtering is the other big thing. But people have to know the difference between all of these treatments, and there are cost differences between all of these treatments that are important. And what might be feasible for some areas are not going to be feasible for other areas. So it's important to, help people understand what their options are and how they can, employ those different options in their communities. And I'd also like to note one thing we did talk about in our group is that not only do we have different problems we're talking about, but we also have different contaminants. So pathogens like bacteria are one kind of category, and then we have another category of chemical contaminants that could come from the air, heavy metals that could come from groundwater, like the arsenic issues, and really things like the heavy metal contaminants that come from the air. That's a harder problem to solve, but we can really help people solve the pathogen problem with some pretty easy steps, like education on different treatment methods. And the chlorine treatment is actually pretty effective for that, as is boiling. And so kind of as we move forward, one thing our group thought it was really important to remember is to get the members of the communities themselves involved. One thing we talked about was getting the women of a community involved, and there's actually already projects in India involving the products Mr. Nandu discussed, where the women basically become entrepreneurs to help sell and educate people about the filtration systems. And then once it kind of gets going, they build a base within their community, and then that base can grow and help keep the ball rolling, so to speak, to encourage the dissemination of the technology and keep people involved in filtering their water and ensuring that they're using safe practices. So overall, I think the takeaway for all of us is that while there are a great number of water issues we can talk about, like wastewater treatment, for example, a lot of those issues can be really expensive, can be difficult for us to manage because we don't control all of these governments, but helping people with their everyday drinking water is accessible, and that's something that we, as a community going forth, trying to make a difference, can really focus on, and I think that, there's a positive vibe that it could be achieved, so that's it.
Hi. So in the agriculture breakout discussion, we had the opportunity to hear from Andy Vermouth, the marketing director of International Development Agencies, Enterprises rather, in Lakewood, and our moderator was Dr. Ajay Jha, the program director of the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics at Colorado State University in Fort Collins. The big question posed was how to get the technologies that we've seen demonstrated today to small farmers at prices that are competitive with the traditional alternatives. One example, sort of a monstrous example of the past, was the implementation of the playground pump in South Africa. The installation of each was about $8,000 to $10,000 per pump. The difference emphasized in the discussion in IDE's approach was that the goal is to bring the cost down so that it's an accessible technology, easy enough and affordable enough for small farmers to purchase rather than just having it given to them, and also helping to improve the local supply chain for these technologies. We discussed the promises and challenges of 4 very encouraging technologies being pioneered by IDE, including treadle pumps, drip irrigation systems, solar photovoltaic water pumps, and a student, Elliot, who we'll talk about later, at Colorado State University, talked a bit about his blue-green algae fertilizer project in Ethiopia, which was very interesting. Some of IDE's projects have involved working with other NGOs, private companies, and governments, and the discussion touched on some of the impacts, advantages and disadvantages of working with other NGOs, private companies, and governments. So first off, the treadle pump. Very successful history with the treadle pump. It's a human-powered micro-irrigation system. IDE has been working with it in Asia for about 29 years now, and more recently in Africa. Just 3 years ago, the Gates Foundation gave IDE a grant to start programs in Ethiopia, which is where most of their products are now tested. 2 other countries in Africa that this grant covered are Zambia, where it's been operating since 1996, and Ghana, just started last year. The Ethiopian case study showed how the pump helps to increase crop yields for small-scale farmers who are using formerly bucket irrigation and then a large diesel-powered pump. The diesel-powered irrigation system was a challenge because a lot of these, as I said, are small farmers, so something that's built for like an 18-acre farm really isn't what they're looking for, and obviously diesel is not something that's necessarily environmentally responsible, whereas the bucket method of irrigation just wasn't very efficient for them. So this has helped them increase crop yields and their personal income and has enabled them to buy more livestock, which is really terrific. Drip irrigation is a much newer project that IDE has been developing. In Zambia, the government is working with the Department of Agriculture to facilitate some small-scale farming, and they'll be doing a marketing campaign around this small-scale no-till drip irrigation. IDE has had some difficulty implementing this drip irrigation in Africa more than it has in Asia because of the history of furrow flood irrigation there. And it just is harder to break people out of what they're used to. So on the other side of the spectrum, with government being more of a block than an aid to helping the implementation of this drip irrigation, is Ethiopia, where large plots of land are actually have been sold for giant irrigation schemes for cereal crops, which are very water intensive to produce. And there's been a lot of the farmers that IDE has been working with who've been displaced from the land, and to complicate things, there are actually no land titles, we were told, in Ethiopia. So the solar voltaic water pumps, very, very new technology that IDE has been working with, and they're available for farmers who have sort of outgrown the lands to the point where the treadle pumps are no longer a viable option for them. But luckily, Indian-produced solar steam pump, which is one of the technologies they've been looking at, has only $200, which is basically at parity level with the cheapest Chinese-made mechanical pumps, which is great because it means it's competitive for people to purchase themselves when they're at that stage for their farm. Elliot Cooper of CSU, a student who attended the discussion, talked about his experience in Ethiopia where there's only one fertilizer supplier, and how his blue-green algae project there has, where it was able to partner with IDE and other NGOs and gained a lot of interest from small-scale farmers for an in-country fertilization production project with a quick turnaround time that would once again make it be at parity levels with these other really, really cheap fertilizer company. And so three final thoughts before we conclude here is the impacts of working with private companies, nonprofits, and governments. One example was the Green Mountain Coffee Company found that its workers were facing a lot of food insecurity for 4 to 6 months of the year because of their focus primarily on producing coffee and to the detriment of failing to produce food crops like for subsistence farming for their family. And they're trying to help work with them, ID's working with them to help encourage intercropping for those farmers so they can still make enough money and also have food for their families and their communities. Some of the nonprofits IDE has partnered with include World Vision, USAID, and this has had a ripple effect of helping to brand IDE products so that farmers will actually come through their cooperatives to IDE asking to be trained in the use of these, and that's really the point. It's more teach a farmer how to use a pump so that after the 3-year intensive cooperative extension period is up, that they can go and teach other farmers about it. Government partnerships are a relatively new development with IDE. Up until now, it's pretty much managed to avoid encountering government policy, with 2 recent exceptions of a conservation farming project in Zambia and World Bank finance project in Ethiopia to remove invasive eucalyptus trees and plant native tree seedlings. Finally, one last question is carbon financing and how that would be done. Who would IDE be partnering with on this? Would it be lobbying government agencies, focused more on market-based carbon financing through private companies or from more private sources of funding, or work with multilateral non-governmental organizations? The bottom line question, of course, being whichever route is chosen, will it ultimately help people to, improve their livelihoods, increase their household incomes.
Okay, yeah. So I did a kind of milk round, went to each of these sessions, and I have to tell you that there was so much stuff going on that I really want to give our rapporteurs another hand for having given us such great distillation of the proceedings. So what we're going to do is this, in the 10-15 minutes left to us, is that we're going to identify, Doug and I, maybe one question which seems to have a common thread running through all 5, or at least 4 of the 5 breakout groups. So I will ask the first question. You have the first question. Okay. So he's going to ask. He's going to ask the first question, and when you discuss that, then I'll ask the second question.
Well, I mean, I think one of the lines that was drawn between everything that people were talking about today was kind of the issue of framing. And we talked about this a lot last year, just kind of with the Energy Justice Conference, about what is energy justice and what are we all doing here and why are we all in the same room. And I think, you know, hearing these reporters talk today and listening to what the different breakout groups did really hammer that home a little bit more. One of the first things we talked about in the lighting breakout group was the framing issue, and everybody went around the room and talked about some lighting experience they had. And each experience that people talked about focused on a different issue. For instance, for some people, lighting was a health issue. For some, it was economic. For some, it was moral. For some, it was education. For some, it was social. For some, it was about poverty or about comfort or consumption. And so there are kind of a lot of different ways to frame this issue. And I think as most people recognize, if you can't frame it very concisely, in this day and age, you're not going to get anywhere, and we're not going to be able to move along together and sort out this problem. And so one of the questions I wanted to talk about a little bit was just to talk about framing energy justice in general and how we frame it. And you know, one of the things that occurred to me was that here, what we're really doing is we're really more or less acting as a utility in these rural areas. And we have these different people working on different components of energy. And the overriding issue, it really is about energy. I mean, there are a lot of different facets of it: health, environment, all these different things I mentioned, but it really is about energy. Think about what Excel Energy does and what Excel Energy provides you in this country. You know, I get my cooking from Excel Energy. I get my lighting from Excel Energy. I get my water from Denver Water, but it's still a utility. Agricultural, you know, whatever. I put it in the fridge and I keep it cool, but because of the utility. And I think kind of the common message, and you know, one of the common messages from all of this is really sitting down and saying, you know, we're not cook stove people, we're not lighting people, we're not the agricultural people. What we're all really doing is kind of providing this energy base and kind of thinking about a different way of being a utility in rural areas in the developing world and providing those services in a different and new way. But I think we really do all have to come together on some sort of specific message. So if anybody has any ideas about kind of messaging and how we can all think about what we're doing as the same, I would really like to hear some of those, because I think that's one of the most important things, putting more voices behind everything that we're doing and putting collective behind it. Yeah, right there.
Okay.
I mean, I guess returning back to the framing issue, maybe one idea would be to hook on, for example, to the Millennium Development Goals and loop back and think about energy as a human right, as opposed to any one of these other frameworks, to think about it as you know, something for cooking or something for health, as energy being a fundamental right of people to progress and improve their lives and to increase the capital of their country and of their family. And it's as simple as that.
Doug, I was struck today by a comment somebody made about, I'm Mark Bent with Sunlight Solar. I was struck today by a comment somebody made saying that if I'm a bottom of the pyramid consumer, I don't want to be called the bottom of the pyramid consumer. I love that phrase because it's such a beautiful visual image when you look at the pyramid thing. And I love the phrase energy poverty as well. But I'm not sure if I was an energy poverty person, that I want it to be called energy poverty.
Right.
And so, but I don't want to put a Band-Aid on it either. I don't want to say it's all just great and, kumbaya. But I think there has to be something that indicates the problem is there. Maybe the rights you were talking about, human rights or human dignity, has to be tied into it. But looking at it from their aspect, there's some negativity to bottom and poverty and all these. I mean, it's all true, but like Warren Buffett says, he just won the lottery. He got born in the right place at the right time. They're just like us. They just didn't get born here. Just a comment.
Yeah, and I think you've highlighted a lot of, what we talked about this morning. I mean, we talked about, with Dan, all of these issues in the developing world, and then we talked about these issues in the United States as well, and this kind of divide between what the message is in the United States versus what the message is in developing countries, and whether that message really should be the same, or whether us defining it in the terms of energy poverty in the U.S. might be not necessarily the greatest way to define it if we're all in this together and it's not just the United States kind of dictating the answer to this.
We're talking about energy efficiency here, and maybe in Kenya they're talking about energy poverty, but it's really efficiency because they have energy, it's just not very efficient energy.
One of the points that came across to me sitting in on a segment of the communications breakout was the extent to which the framing of the issue for developing countries will be different from the framing of the issues for us over here, because we need a message that resonates with people who will give money or will fund this or take decisions about something that doesn't actually affect them. I mean, we're not really affected by energy poverty in one way or the other. So I think that's one of the interesting issues that was brought up in the communications breakout group.
But it has to be addressed. I live in northern Iraq. The Kurds are called, the fight is called Peshmerga. And translation of that is, less of us, we're going to go die. And I explained to them, the army has be all you can be. And I said, there's a whole bunch of difference between we're all going to go die and be all you can be. But it's a totally different, society, totally different context.
Okay, can I raise one question and we had discussion on that? One of the things that I saw running through, a thread that was running through a lot of most of the discussions, was the question of how to inform people, make them knowledgeable about the dangers of any one of these things. So whether it be drinking water or whether it be whether it be indoor pollution or whether it be problems caused by burning candles, or the situation in agriculture. One of the issues that seems to be running through all this is, what is the best way of, first of all, informing those who are affected by this? Because many of them don't know it. We heard people say, we've been drinking this water all the time. And in our field work in Peru, people say, well, indoor pollution is not a problem, we've been doing that. I mean, this doesn't affect us. So one of the things is, how do you best communicate this to those who are affected, who are injured? And secondly, to bring back the point I had raised about communications, how do you communicate the gravity of this situation to those of us living in this part of the world who can make a difference in terms of decisions we make? So two issues. First of all, does anybody have any great ideas or any ideas about what is the best method of communicating, informing people of some of the dangers, public health dangers and other dangers that arise from being exposed to the kind of energy that they're using, or the absence of good, safe drinking water? Yes, there's a... Oh, yeah.
Well, I wanted to respond to the first question very quickly, and that was my response to the common thread would be technology. In each case, technology is important. Obviously, people need to be educated on how to use the technology, but just for example, in the water thing, you have fences that protect the source water and the filter there. And then on the other flip side of the coin is you apply the technologies, which every technology has got a lot of embodied energy in terms of the research and the development and all the resources that have gone in, materials and stuff that have gone into it. And so that's where the energy aspect comes into play. And then the second, on the other end of the spectrum would be something that hasn't been mentioned, is the ecosystem services, which is basically what everybody's trying to achieve here, is try to get to a point where, we can use the technologies to protect their environment and restore some of the services that people exploit. So that would be my answer to the first question.
There was somebody at the back there, and then Aj. We'll be finished in 5 minutes.
I'm Susan Beckett. I am the Energy Program Manager at the Environmental Center here on campus. And it seems like most of these issues have one thing in common. We're really trying to get a change in behavior is really what we want. And this is something that I talked about in our session for cooking. And I would strongly recommend that you guys all look up something called community-based social marketing. It's a very, very powerful tool, and they really lay out steps that you can do to incur behavior change. And they have a publication called Fostering Sustainable Behavior that's a very good publication. And at the root of this process, at the very first step, is determining what the barriers are to behavior change. And there are things that us sitting in this room, growing up where we did, at least most of us, cannot fathom the barriers that people in developing nations are facing. So we really need to go in and determine why, they've been drinking water, how they've been drinking water for generations. What is the barrier to changing that? What are the underlying cultural factors that we don't see as outsiders? And that can be a really, really difficult